Hello everyone, and welcome to the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee webinar on Rare Materials and RDA Exploring the Issues. I'm Janet Ardberg, your host and a member of the committee. Today we have two presenters. First is Robert Maxwell. Bob is a senior librarian and chair of the Special Collections and Formats Catalog Department at the Harold B. Lee Library at Brigham Young University. His most recent book, Ferber, A Guide for the Perplexed, was published in 2008. He has chaired the RBMS Bibliographic Standards Committee of the ACRL and has served on the Committee on Cataloging, Description, and Access of ALCTS. He is the author of the Highsmith Award-winning Maxwell's Guide to Authority Work, as well as Maxwell's Guide to AACR2, and is currently completing the manuscript for Maxwell's Guide to RDA to be published soon by ALA. Next, our presenter is John Attig. John is an authority control librarian at Penn State University, where he has worked since 1978 and where he currently holds the rank of Distinguished Librarian. He has been active in the development and maintenance of standards relating to cataloging, including the Mark 21 formats, AACR2 and RDA. Since 2007, he has served as the American Library Association's representative to the Joint Steering Committee for Development of RDA. He was one of the editors of Descriptive Cataloging of Rare Material Books. Welcome, Bob and John. Now, during the webinar, if you have questions, go ahead and type them into the question box shown on your screen. Bob and John will answer the questions at the end of their presentation. If all the questions are not answered when the hour has ended, then the session will run a few minutes over time. For those of you that need to sign off, please note that you can hear the answers to the questions as the webinar is being recorded, and you will receive an email shortly after the conclusion of the program with a link to the recording. And if necessary, Bob and John will email answers to the questions that end up not being answered during the program. You can also email them with your queries. You will also receive a copy of the webinar slides. Now, as we get ready to turn the program over to Bob and John, there may be a slight delay as we turn the presentation over to them. Thank you.
Good afternoon. This is John Attig. I'll be going first this afternoon. Welcome to our webinar on early printed resources. Bob will be going through an example of cataloging a rare book using guidelines and instructions in RDA. Before that, however, I'm going to talk about alternatives to using RDA and why you might wish to consider those for describing rare books. Like AACR2, RDA is designed for general cataloging. Although it attempts to cover all types of resources, it does not always provide all the detail that might be required, either in a special library or by catalogers of rare materials. RDA provides for specialized cataloging by including alternatives and options to be applied in special cases, and exceptions to be applied to specific categories of resources. The alternatives and exceptions are to be applied instead of the general instructions that apply to all other resources. Instructions for early printed resources are given in RDA as alternatives and exceptions. Further, RDA allows the use of other guidelines and instructions to be applied instead of RDA at the discretion of the institution creating the description. In the case of early printed resources, the Library of Congress has chosen to instruct its catalogers to apply descriptive cataloging of rare materials instead of RDA for books and serials published before 1801, which is LC's definition of a rare book. For those of you who are not already familiar with descriptive cataloging of rare materials, I want to give a little bit of background. In 1981, the Library of Congress issued Bibliographic Description of Rare Books, to be used as a supplement to AACR2 for cataloging rare books at the Library of Congress. BDRB, we use acronyms for all of these things, was written primarily by Ben Tucker, head of the Office of Descriptive Cataloging Policy at LC. In 1991, a revised version was developed called Descriptive Cataloging of Rare Books, DCRB. This was a collaboration between Ben Tucker and a group of rare book cataloging experts under the auspices of the Bibliographic Standards Committee of the Rare Books and Manuscripts section of ACRL. In the early years of this century, a few years back, the Bibliographic Standards Committee decided to update DCRB and to expand it to include rules for other types of rare materials. The first result of this was a revision of DCRB entitled Descriptive Cataloging of Rare Materials, parens books, or DCRMB, which was published by the Library of Congress in 2007. Descriptive cataloging of rare materials is intended to be a suite of standards applying to different categories of rare materials. The module for books was the first one published in 2007. The module for serials was published the following year. A module for graphic materials will appear soon. This module is also an update to the publication Graphic Materials, Rules for Describing Original Items and Historical Collections, which was published in 1982 by the Library of Congress and has been in dire need of revision. A module for music is nearing completion, and modules for cartographic resources and for manuscripts are being developed at this time. As noted, descriptive cataloging of rare materials is being developed by the Bibliographic Standards Committee of the Rare Books and Manuscripts section of ACRL in collaboration with the Library of Congress. Printed versions of DCRM are being published by the Library of Congress. DCRM is included in Cataloger's desktop with links to other relevant documentation in both directions. Descriptive cataloging of rare materials provides rules for the description of rare materials. In RDA terms, DCRM includes instructions for recording the attributes of manifestations and items, but not for recording the attributes of works and expressions. DCRM is based on AACR2 rules. By editorial policy, DCRM differs from AACR2 only when required by the descriptive needs of rare materials. DCRM does not contain rules for choice and form of access points. Other standards such as AACR2 or RDA must be used for access points. The Bibliographic Standards Committee, after consideration of their program for developing DCRM and of the schedule for implementing RDA, have made the recommendation that catalogers apply either DCRM or RDA, but not attempt a hybrid description that includes features of both. As noted, this does not apply to access points. In terms of coding and MARC, this policy would mean that records would be coded as AACR2 in Leader Byte 18, the descriptive cataloging form, and as DCRM in 040 subfield E. The Bibliographic Standards Committee has appointed a task force on DCRM and RDA. This group has begun work and has made some preliminary decisions. Two modules nearing completion, those for graphics and for music, will continue to be based on AACR2, although RDA-compatible alternatives may be defined. These will be separate documents, not part of the DCRM publication itself. Further modules under development will continue to be based on AACR2, at least until such time as an RDA-based text for DCRM has been drafted. The task force has begun discussions on what such a text might contain. This will be a long-term project that will undoubtedly take several years to complete. The result would be revised versions of DCRM for books and serials, which would be based on RDA, and a base text that could be used to revise the other modules. To give you some sense of what is involved in cataloging rare materials and why you might want to make certain implementation decisions, I want to go over some of the objectives and principles of DCRM. These factors are relevant whether you are applying DCRM or RDA or any other standard for describing rare materials. Early printed materials exist in a variety of different manifestations, whether those be issues or editions or variant states. Users of rare materials typically do need to distinguish between all of these different manifestations. One of the ways of supporting this is for the description to record very precisely what appears on the title page and other sources of information. The standard of transcription in RDA might be characterized as take what you see. This leads to rather exact and complete transcription, in some cases even more complete than you would achieve by applying DCRM. On the other hand, DCRM also deals with issues such as transposition of information. When elements occur in a different order on the source, then they need to be recorded in the description. With omissions from the description and marking of those, and the marking and correcting of errors, misprints, and defects in the copy being described. Users of early printed resources are often investigating the physical processes and the post-production history and other types of context for the resources being described. Rare book catalogers frequently record such information, typically in notes, and these notes describe the evidence that was left by these processes and by the history of the publication. Rare book catalogers attempt to include all bibliographically significant information in order to allow users to search and identify resources based on characteristics typical of early printed resources, and also to select relevant resources without having to access the actual materials, either because the materials are available only at other institutions or because of the need to preserve the materials from contact until a researcher has decided that they definitely need to examine them. Finally, hand-printed and hand-bound resources often differ from copy to copy. Rare book catalogers attempt to describe any features of the copy that might be unique. So, with regard to RDA, here are the alternatives as I see them. You can apply DCRM either in conjunction with RDA or instead of RDA, as is recommended by the BIB Standards Committee. Or you can apply RDA along with the alternatives and exceptions for early printed resources, which is what Bob is going to illustrate in the rest of this presentation. And in either case, you should apply RDA for access points, particularly if you are contributing to shared programs such as NACO or BIBCO. Make this decision based on your institution's overall policies. your past experience, for example, whether you currently use DCRM or not, and the needs of the user community for your early printed resources. Now, Bob will illustrate how to catalog a rare book, applying RDA and the alternatives and exceptions contained therein. Bear with us while we switch presenters again.
Thank you for coming to this webinar. In this section, we're going to discuss how to use RDA to catalog an early printed book using a fairly simple example. Early printed resources are defined in RDA as materials manufactured before the advent of machine printing in approximately 1825 to 1830. Now, John has presented background about rare materials cataloging and its needs, including thoughts about continuing to use AACR2 with DCRMB or alternatively using RDA. My part of this presentation will be to show how RDA can be used and used well to describe rare materials following rare materials cataloging principles, but not explicitly referring to DCRM. This is particularly important for libraries like my own that have adopted RDA as their cataloging standard, or for libraries or catalogers who would like to use RDA in all their cataloging rather than trying to learn and remember two standards. I plan to go through my presentation fairly briskly and won't be reading anything or everything on the slides, but you'll all have access to the PowerPoints and the recording of this webinar. There will be time for questions for either John or me at the end. So, the place I usually start when cataloging anything is with the title proper. RDA says to take the title proper from what it calls the preferred source of information, which for a printed book is the title page. If there is no title page, which happens occasionally with early printed books, the title page can be taken from the colophon, the cover, or a caption. I would not recommend using the cover because with this sort of materials, in almost all cases, the binding was added after publication by the purchaser of the book. The resource we're going to catalog has a title page, so we'll use that as the source for the title proper rather than the colophon, which also has a presentation of the title. And you all get to practice looking at a Gothic font with this pamphlet's title page. It's important to pay attention to the wording of RDA when it says record or transcribe. When it says transcribe, it means copy what you see, exactly as to wording and spelling, but not necessarily as to capitalization and punctuation. When it says record, it means follow the instructions in RDA for that particular element, which sometimes call for recording information in a different form from that found in a resource. In the case of title proper, we are told, as you can see, to transcribe. Punctuation is generally transcribed as found, but as in AACR2, punctuation may be added or in some cases omitted for clarity. As for capitalization, RDA 1.7.2 calls for applying RDA's Appendix A, which is close to AACR2's capitalization rules. This practice will be followed in this presentation. However, be aware that RDA 1.7.1 allows agencies to follow in-house guidelines for capitalization, such as a guideline might say, follow the Chicago Manual of Style, or accepting harvested data, so for example, copying and pasting, without modification. Neither of these practices will be followed in this presentation. There are no particular problems with this title page, except from reading the Gothic script, except that following RDA 1.7.5, we need to replace the nasal mark you can see over the O in the third word compendiosissimus with the bracketed M, which is what it stands for. This procedure is also covered in Library of Congress Policy Statement 2.1.4. RDA doesn't say what to do with the hyphen in the middle of Thekilimus at the end of the first line. We'll fall back on customary practice and not transcribe it. The title means very complete and easy method of writing letters. And you can see, just as with any kind of cataloging, the title is recorded in the 245 field in a MARC record. We have a couple of variants on the title proper that might be considered important for identification or access. Variants based on the replacement of the symbol in the title page compendiosissimus and a variant title found in the colophon. I've recorded two variants from the manipulation of that symbol that we saw on the theory that library users might try to find this book using these variants, one without the brackets and one without the added letter. Whether to add this or any other variant title is entirely left up to the cataloger's judgment in RDA. Variant titles are not core, which means not required. Do you think users of your database would attempt to find a particular resource using a particular variant? If so, you should record it. Additionally, there's a variant form of the title in the colophon, which I have chosen to record, as well as a variant form without brackets. Note that we've replaced symbols in the colophon again with the supplied form in brackets, just as we did with the title proper. So that's my variant number 1 and number 2 on this page. We could also record as a variant the form without adding the bracketed letters, but in this cataloger's judgment, that variant is not important for identification or access. If you disagree, you could add it. The colophon translates, "This is the end of the letter writing method by Mr. Poggio, the extremely excellent orator and poet. It was printed at the expense of Alexander Aliata on the last day of March, 1505. And this is what our record looks like so far. Statements of responsibility in RDA can be taken from anywhere in the resource without bracketing. Unlike AACR2, the only time we would need to bracket a statement of responsibility would be if we took one from outside the resource itself, which would be rare. As with AACR2, transcription of statements of responsibility is exactly the same as for title proper. Transcribe exactly what you see as to wording and spelling, but not necessarily as to capitalization or punctuation. So here's our statement of responsibility. Following Appendix A, we're going to capitalize the word Florentino, which isn't capitalized on the resource. Otherwise, copy exactly what you see. The statement means composed by Poggio the Florentine. And here's now what we have so far. I've added the statement of responsibility. Place of publication is core in RDA, meaning that something has to be recorded in this element, if only the phrase place of publication not identified, which replaces AACR2's SL. Note that for early printed books, possible sources for this information include the colophon. And that's a likely place that you might find it. Before I go on, I need to talk about something that has nothing directly to do with RDA, a new mark field that will be used to record this sort of information in RDA records. This is the 264 field. Like 260, it is repeatable, and the first indicator tells whether the statement is for the earliest, an intervening, or the current or latest information about the element. This is for resources such as serials or multi-part monographs that exist over a period of time. Of particular interest is the second indicator, which specifies exactly what RDA element is being recorded: a production statement, a publication statement, a distribution statement, a manufacture statement, or copyright information. This means that unlike the 260 field, these 5 different types of information cannot be mixed in a single field. If the cataloger wants to record, for example, a publication statement as well as a copyright date, this will require 2 264 fields. You might be thinking, why? Actually, it's good because it will now be crystal clear exactly what we're recording. In the 260 field, with these 5 functions mixed together, it wasn't always clear. We'll see how this might work out regarding an early printed book in a few slides. 264 has been implemented in OCLC and is available for use. I will use 264 in this presentation, but we should note that OCLC has recently issued a statement advising against using the new field until guidelines for its use are available. PCC should be issuing such guidelines very soon. What I will show in this presentation is in line with the proposed PCC guidelines. As mentioned, the place of publication is core, and as we saw a few slides ago, RDA says to transcribe places of publication in the form in which they appear on the source of information. Whether you transcribe the word designators depends on how you interpret this. Customarily, in rare materials cataloging, we transcribe parts of the statement like designators, which means this book is for sale at. This is important because it clarifies in the context with the name that this is a bookseller, not a publisher in the modern sense, and it can be justified by RDA by 2.8.4.4, which says that we may record words or phrases indicating the function performed by a person. Optionally, in RDA, you can transcribe an address that appears in conjunction with the place of publication. This is the case with any kind of resource, not just early printed materials. However, catalogers of early printed materials are more likely to transcribe an address than a cataloger of modern materials. Note there is no option in RDA for supplying another form of the name of the place. So, for example, we wouldn't bracket in Paris after transcribing Parisis in this case, as there was in AACR2. We'll add the address in Vico Sancti Jacobi. The place of publication information translated means for sale in Paris on St. James Street. The publisher's name element is required, meaning something has to be included in this element, if only the phrase publisher not identified, which replaces AACR2's SN. Note that for early printed books, possible sources do include the colophon for this information. In this case, the person named on the title page is a bookseller acting as a publisher. With early printed books, we're customarily somewhat free in defining the bookseller, or indeed the printer, as the publisher for purposes of cataloging, because the same publishing organization that exists now didn't exist then. In this example, we'll say the bookseller is the publisher. Note that RDA explicitly says that for early printed resources, printers and booksellers may be treated as publishers. That's in 2.8.4.1. The name is in the ablative case in Latin, controlled by the preposition ab, so we can't drop the preposition. In rare cataloging, we wouldn't anyway. A regione divi benedicti, meaning in St. Benedict's neighborhood, continues the address of the bookseller in Paris. Customarily, in rare materials cataloging, we transcribe all of this stuff. The sharp-eyed among you might have noticed that I transcribed divi, D-I-U-I, exactly as I found it, that is, with a U, even though the letter represents the consonantal V in Latin. Consonantal V was transcribed with a V in the word immediately above it, Vico. The letters I, J, U, V, and W are problematic when cataloging early printed materials. While it isn't quite correct to say that we transcribe exactly what we see when encountering these letters, as I did in this case, problems regularly occur when converting uppercase letters to lowercase in the transcription, these particular letters. Given the time allowed for this webinar, I'm unable to give more information about the treatment of these letters, but be aware that there are issues here. Again, data publication is a core element, meaning we are required to record something in this element. Although, unlike AACR2, we can, as a last resort, record date of publication not identified. Note that the instructions say to record, not to transcribe the date of publication. The basic guideline is to record numerals in the form preferred by the cataloging agency. However, there are two alternative rules that you can see on this screen that allow transcribing. We will follow alternative 2 in this record, which you can see under 1.8.2, record numerals in the form in which they appear on the source, and then add the equivalent numerals in the form preferred by the agency in brackets. Now, there is no date of publication on the title page of this pamphlet. There is a date on the colophon, but that's the date the book was printed. Technically, there is no date of publication. So we have two choices. We can either supply a date of publication, or we can record date of publication not identified. General materials catalogers in RDA will probably make assumptions about the date of publication and supply a date based on something like a printing date, as shown in the first example on this slide, but rare materials catalogers might choose to be more cautious about this matter. Either way of recording the element might be appropriate for this particular book, but for the sake of this demonstration, I will use the second version. And here is what it looks like in our record so far. Take note of the formatting of the new 264 field at the bottom of the record. Place of manufacture, or printing, is only core if no place of publication or distribution has been identified. Since we did record a place of publication, it's not required here. Furthermore, no place of manufacture is given in this pamphlet. Technically, we don't need to record anything at all here, but I'm going to record place of manufacture not identified anyway. This is entirely optional. As we shall see, I intend to record other information about the manufacturer later in this field. Again, the manufacturer's name element is only core if a publisher or distributor's name has not been identified. In the case of our book, we have already recorded something in the publisher's name element, so we could leave this out. However, in rare materials cataloging, in order to better identify the resource, we tend to like to record everything we can, so I'm going to record something in this element. In this case, we have a printing statement on the colophon, but the printer's name is not explicitly given. However, the person who paid for the printing is named. We will transcribe that statement. It means printed at the expense of Alexander Aliata. Note that again we've had to expand a symbol, the bracketed form in the last word. The date of manufacture is core if a date of publication, distribution, or copyright have not been identified. Note that identifying includes supplying a date, which we might have done in this record. However, in the case of this pamphlet, none of these dates was identified in my record, so date of manufacture becomes core. Note that the instructions say to record, not to transcribe the date, just as we saw with the date of publication. However, remember that there are two alternative rules which allow transcribing. We will follow alternative 2 in this record. RDA doesn't say how to record Roman numerals from early printed books when applying the option to transcribe. The first version follows DCRMB, which is to omit the periods. The second transcribes the numeral more exactly. We're also applying the option to add the Arabic numeral in brackets. And here's our record so far. Note the pair of 264 fields, one for the publication statement and the other for the manufacturer statement. How these are labeled in the public display is of course up to the individual institution, but they could be labeled very precisely to make clear to the database user what kind of information is being recorded and conveyed to them. Extent is core in RDA if the resource is complete. The exception, that is for incomplete resources, mainly applies to not yet finished multi-part monographs or serials, not necessarily to defective copies that might actually happen quite frequently in early printed book cataloging. Note that there is a subtle change between AACR2. You'll have to come back later and read the subtle change. But anyway, there is a subtle change between AACR2 and RDA regarding deciding whether the book is paginated or foliated. This actually brings RDA and general cataloging right over to the rule for this in DCRMB, which does warm my rare book cataloger's heart. Note that in RDA, the abbreviation P for pages is never used in an extent statement. Pages is always spelled out. However, our little book is unpaginated. Rare book catalogers will almost invariably count the exact number of pages. For rare materials catalogers, a large number of pages does not mean that the number is not readily ascertainable. In this case, the pamphlet does not have a large number of pages, and so there's no question that the exact number is readily ascertainable. Recording the phrase unnumbered pages rather than bracketing the number is one of the more significant differences between RDA cataloging of rare materials and DCRM cataloging of rare materials. In this case, it isn't a major problem, but extent statements for rare books can become quite complex, and so in some cases an RDA extent statement for a particularly complicated early printed book might present difficulties. A remedy for this might be in the wings, but it isn't here yet. The dimensions element is not core, but North American rare materials catalogers will always record dimensions. Other rare cataloging communities may differ on this. Some prefer not to record dimensions because they are usually unique to each item. That is, your copy of the pamphlet Modus Epistolandi might be a different size from mine because of the unique binding and the way people might have cut down the paper or something. RDA lets you choose which you prefer because it isn't core. Note there is no full stop or period after CM. In RDA, as in most other standards, CM is considered a symbol, not an abbreviation. A period would only appear following CM in an RDA record if ISBD punctuation required it. And the only time ISBD punctuation requires it is if a series statement appears in the record. This is a somewhat silly distinction, I agree, but now you know the rule and it's easy enough to remember. There is no series statement in the record that I'm creating, so there is no period after the CM. I don't have time to tell you how to figure out what the format of a book is, but if you know it or can calculate it, RDA permits you to record it, and rare materials catalogers traditionally do record this information. It is recorded in a marked record in parentheses following the dimensions element. Note that the only difference between RDA and DCRMB for this element is that the word folio is spelled out in RDA. In this case, this book is quarto, and so we're putting 4TO at the end in parentheses of the 300 field. RDA provides for notes about the manifestation, and here I've recorded information about the printing history of the expression, the fact that this manifestation has a publisher's device on the title page, and the kind of type used in the manifestation. Another common type of note about the manifestation frequently recorded by rare materials catalogers is the presence of signed gatherings, which are called signatures. Again, I don't have time to explain to you how to identify or record signatures, but if you do know, this note will look familiar to you. It is extremely common in rare materials cataloging to record information specific to the library's copy, such as the binding, which will be different on all copies of early printed books, imperfections, writing on the book, known previous owners, and so forth. In this record, I have recorded information about the binding. DCRMB recommends recording this sort of note, the name of the institution to which it applies, here BYU. Note that I've used a 590 note to record this information. It is also permissible to record this in a 500 note with the library's mark symbol coded at the end of the note in subfield 5, which codes the note as local. Either practice is acceptable, though in my experience 590 seems to be more widespread. And I realize the type is getting smaller and smaller, but here's our record so far. And you'll all get a copy of this later, so we'll just move on. An element new to RDA is media type. This element is not core, but most RDA catalogers are currently recording it. A book has the media type called unmediated because nothing like a computer or a DVD player is required to use the information stored in it. Carrier type, which is core, tells the format used to store the information in the resource. I've only listed the unmediated carrier types here. A printed codex book, such as the one we are describing now, has the carrier type volume. While we're on these types, let's record the content type, which is also core. Strictly speaking, it doesn't have to do with the manifestation at all, but with the expression. What is the type of content of this expression? For example, it could exist as text on paper, or it could be recited out loud and recorded. These would be two expressions of the same work. The content type for our pamphlet is text. Many elements related to the work or expression contained in a resource are recorded in RDA MARC authority records, but some elements may be recorded instead in the bibliographic record, including notes describing the nature of the content or a summary of the content such as that recorded here. In my opinion, this sort of information would be more efficiently recorded in an authority record for the work or expression and thus applicable and available to every manifestation description. But in the current MARC format, this information can only be recorded in bibliographic records, so if desired, this note would need to be recorded in every bibliographic record for resources embodying this particular work, rather than just once in the authority record. Such is life. And here's what we have so far. It's getting bigger as we go. We've done what used to be called the descriptive portions of the record, but of course we're not done yet. We need to convey to the user the relationships of the resource to other entities such as persons. And in the MARC bibliographic record, this is done by adding access points in 1XX, 6XX, 7XX, and 8XX fields. One relationship in RDA is core or required, and that is the relationship between the resource and its principal creator. Others are optional. Some possibilities are listed on this slide, all of which are often given in rare materials cataloging records. Additionally, RDA encourages us to specify the nature of the relationship, and one of the ways to do this is to attach to the access point a relationship designator. Relationship designators may be taken from RDA appendixes I through L, or if the terms there are not appropriate, they may be taken from other standard lists such as the MARC relator terms list at the URL given on this slide. Although the use of relationship designators, also known as relator terms, was not widespread in the general North American cataloging community previous to RDA, it has always been a common practice in the rare materials cataloging community, so RDA's renewed emphasis on using these designators will be nothing new to this community, and in fact welcome. In future linked data systems, specifying the nature of the relationships will be crucial, so we might as well start preparing our data now by including this information in all of our cataloging, not just rare materials cataloging. Here we've recorded two relationships, and the nature of the relationship is specified in subfield E of each access point. The relationship designator author is from RDA Appendix I. The relationship designator bookseller is from the MARC relator terms list. As John mentioned earlier, the form of these access points is governed by RDA. One difference you might see in this slide is the word active in subfield D of the 700 field, which in an AACR2 access point would have been FL, which stood for flourished. We need to identify that our record is cataloged according to RDA guidelines, and this is done by recording an I in leader position 18 and subfield E RDA in the 040 field as seen in this example. The positioning of subfield E immediately after subfield B for the language of cataloging is shown here, is not required, but it is recommended to make it easier to find if you've got a really long string in the 040 field. So here we are, finished with our record. Maybe it's not as painful as you might have thought, or maybe it's more painful than you might have thought. We'll have to see. Anyway, this is an example of an RDA record for a rare book. I'm including here for your later use when you get the slides an appendix that lists all of the RDA special provisions for early printed books. And I thank you for being here. You are certainly welcome to contact me later at this email address if you like, or John and I will be glad to take questions now.
Okay, Bob, let me start reading the first question, and I hope you can see this on your screen also. This is at the very beginning.
I actually can't see the screen because it hasn't been, you haven't taken over from me.
Oh. Do I need to change presenters?
I think you probably do.
Okay. Okay, just a second. Let me get my slide up. Is this okay?
Sure.
Okay, let me read the first question. I have, first question came in at the very beginning of your slide, your presentation, Bob, and the question is, we have a question about what is going to happen in shared catalogs if people each make their own decisions about RDA or DCRM.
That's an issue that hasn't been resolved yet, but I'm hoping people will not engage in cataloging wars to change, for example, RDA records into AACR2 or DC. I don't really have an answer for that because that's an issue that's really an important issue right now and needs to be thought about and talked about.
Okay. This question came in around slide 31, if that helps you, and it says the alternative manuals to AACR2, including DCRM, depend on the separation of description and access enshrined in Part 1 and Part 2 of AACR2. RDA does not seem to have a conceptual and certainly does not have a structural equivalent to this distinction. How will this affect the construction and utility of manuals for rare materials?
John, would you like to talk about that?
Thank you, Bob.
You're welcome.
I'm not sure I agree with the premise. I think it's stated differently in RDA than it is in ASCR, but I think the distinction between attributes of manifestation and item and attributes and relationships applying to works and expressions very closely mirrors the distinction in ASCR2 between description and access. I think it is possible to translate this into terms that will be meaningful in RDA.
Okay. The next question came around slide 37, Bob, and it says, recording the CM and in punctuation, the mark format says field 300 ends with a period if there is a 4XX in the record.
That's right.
Otherwise, it ends with a period unless another mark of punctuation or a closing parentheses is present. The otherwise phrase means that the 300 does end with a full stop unless another mark of punctuation is present, and the CM is not a punctuation mark?
I don't have the mark format instructions right in front of me right now, but if my understanding is what I have explained is correct for RDA, and if the mark formatting at the moment says something different, it means it hasn't been updated yet. But my understanding is that if CM appears at the end of that field, it is there's no period after it unless there is a 4XX in the field, which is for a series statement.
Okay. And the next question came around slide 42.
But let me just say, I think this is not if somebody makes a mistake and puts a period there when they shouldn't, that is a venial and not a mortal sin. I don't think it's. I think it's not. It's less important than we're making of it. That punctuation.
Okay. This question came around slide 42, and it says, it sounds like a cataloger will still have to resort to DCRM parentheses B in order to transcribe the I, J, U, V, ND expanded symbols. Is this true?
DCRM does have a standard for transcribing those symbols. There is also a separate standard for transcribing I, J, U, and V, which I don't have the RDA, the Library of Congress policy statement number right in memorized for it, but there is a Library of Congress policy statement embedded in the policy statements for how to treat those letters as well. So there are, you could follow in an RDA record, you could follow probably either one, but probably in my own cataloging I'll continue to follow the IJUV rules that are given in DCRMB, but I think you could also follow the Library of Congress policy statement on IJUV. Either way, we need to do something, because the reason it's a problem is because the printers of the alphabet used by the printers in this period did not have a separate letter for I and J and for U and V, and so we have to figure out what to do with it when we're changing it from an uppercase to a lowercase letter, whether to transcribe it in its modern form, how to transcribe it.
Okay. Next question has to do with the 008 leader and that subfield I, and the question is, wasn't that used for pre-AACR2 records?
I think it was, yes it was, but these are going to be distinguished from those records by the presence of RDA in the 040 field. John, do you have anything to say about that?
The definition of value I in Leader 18 was redefined at the point where we started dealing with RDA. So it's primarily now defined as describing the use of ISBD punctuation and not of any particular descriptive cataloging rules.
Okay. Next question is, why would I use RDA rather than DCRM to describe a resource?
Well, I've just given a few reasons at the beginning. I mean, if there are lots of new things in RDA. I mean, if you like the new types to be able to record them, for example, or simply if you want to have all of your records in your library be of the same kind of record, especially new records. Our library, for instance, does much more general cataloging than rare book cataloging. We'd like a kind of a uniformity of approach in our library, so that's one of the reasons we've chosen to go with RDA. I'm hoping that in the very not too far away, we will be able to reconcile some of these issues. And our library is a DCRM library. We've always used DCRMB for rare materials. We're just moving ahead. We're going to try and see if RDA will be adequate for it in the meantime, while we're waiting for the DCRM suite to be updated to RDA.
Okay, next question. Is there any provision in RDA for the information provided in the Mark 752 field?
As far as I know, there isn't, but that wasn't an AACR2 issue either, I don't think. John, do you have any thoughts about that?
That's exactly what I would have said. There are a number of data elements in MARC that were not based on any particular cataloging rules. So, no, there's nothing comparable at this time.
Okay, I'm just seeing one last question here, and it consists of two questions. It says, is the concept of main entry still alive in RDA? And then it goes on to say, in Bob's book, if the printer only appeared in the colophon, how would your 264s differ?
On the last question, the 264s, it doesn't matter where any of this appears. The 264 with the second indicator 1 represents the publishing information, and the 264 with the second indicator 3, if I got that right, I'm not quite used to them yet, represents the manufacturer. And so it doesn't matter, yeah, that's a 3, it doesn't matter where you find the information, it's recorded in a particular discrete field depending on what kind of information it is. Was that, I'm sorry, I'm kind of forgetting what the question was. Is that what the question was?
Yes, and then the other one was, is the concept of main entry, wait a minute, is the main entry still alive in RDA?
John, I'd like to, I wonder if you'd like to talk about that.
Okay. This has nothing specifically to do with rare materials. In other words, what I'm going to say would apply to any type of resource. The concept of main entry, the term main entry is not used in RDA. The concept is still there in the sense that the authorized access point representing a work or expression will, under most circumstances, include the name of the creator, or the principal creator, or the first named creator. That the basis for selecting that is very similar to the AACR2 rules for choosing the main entry. And when there is no creator named, what you end up with what we used to call title main entry. In other words, only the preferred title constitutes the access point representing the work.
And I'd just like to point out that there is only one core relationship required in RDA, and that's the relationship between the resource and the principal or first named creator, which means that RDA, if we continue to code them in the same way, that an RDA record may have a 1XX field in the same instances that an AACR2 record would have. Is that what you think, John?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay, we have about 5 minutes left, and we have a few questions that have come in since I said it was the last question, so we'll see if we can answer those. If the relationship between work and creator is core, what do you do when you don't know who created it?
You do the same thing as you do in any case. You just don't record it. You don't. If RDA core elements, if you don't have the information, they're only core if you actually can get the information. And so in this case, you would not record a relationship if you don't know who the creator is.
Okay. When I look at the MARC record you have created, I see very little advantage for the human user of the record. There are some obvious advantages for machine manipulation. Could you comment?
Not really. I mean, I think that's right. I mean, I don't. I'm not sure whether the question is meant to ask about whether an RDA record has more advantage for a human user. I mean, my record is wound up being pretty similar to an AACR2 record, and so I would say the disadvantages for human users is pretty much the same in the RDA record as in the AACR2 record. But there are certainly advantages for the machine manipulation of these records, which is pretty important consideration to think about. I mean, I think, for instance, the 264 field dividing things into identifying exactly what the elements are is important. I believe the new 3XX fields will be useful and important in machines manipulating records. Do you have any comments, John, about this?
No, I don't think so. That's pretty much what I would have said. The new coding does allow you to be a bit more precise in terms of labeled displays, for instance, so that you can indicate more clearly what different pieces of data are. But in general, I would say that the similarities between an RDA record and an AACR2 record are larger than the differences.
Okay, we've just about run out of time. We have 2 questions left, and I'm going to go ahead and read those. And then if anyone needs to leave, just remember that the program is being recorded and you can have access to that. Okay, first question. Regarding 264, in early printed books, the various functions of publication are not necessarily well delineated. I hope I said that right. Would you still use 264? Can 260 and 264 both be used in the same record?
This will depend on what the guidelines are that I talked about, that OCLC recommended that we wait until the guidelines are given. I believe the guidelines are going to recommend that we not use 260 in new RDA records. I think it's not, that is completely correct, that the different functions are not always well delineated, and as now you kind of need to make some decisions. I mean, the decisions using the 260 field are essentially, we're going to decide that this name is the publisher, even though we're not sure, and you can certainly still make that decision with the 264 field that you're going to record a particular name as a publisher, even if you're not positive what it is. I guess we're going to be presented with the necessity to actually think about it, though, more than we did in the 260, whether it's a publisher or a printer or some other sort of function.
Okay, last question. What about use of 340 for book format with RDA?
340. I'm being stumped here. John, you want to say something about this?
What is this?
I was just checking the documentation to see.
Is that a typo?
And I crashed my browser, so I can't get to it. Is book format one of the things that was added to 340 in the latest
I'm looking at it
group
right
of
now.
mark changes.
I'm looking at it. I have to say, it sounds like we don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah, we'll look it up and post it.
Oh, book format is there. So I
Okay,
think
so that's a recent change in mark.
Yes, and actually, I mean that's a recent change that I hadn't noticed, and I might have actually demonstrated if I had noticed it. That might actually be a once more. I mean, the progression of these new mark fields is to make more and more discrete and clear exactly what you have here. And so right now we're just simply recording book format at the end after the size of the book. Instead, if we record it in 340 with the subfield M, then it's completely clear what it is. And I mean, right now it's clear to a human user, but I think perhaps it would be good. That would be a good thing to put it into 340. That I just hadn't noticed it because it's so new. I'm glad someone brought it to our attention.
Thank you, Pat.
Okay, that ends all our questions, and thank you, Bob and John. And what I'd like to say is thank you for that insightful program that has provided with that helpful information on rare materials and RDA. We hope you found today's webinar useful, and you will soon receive a short online evaluation form. Please take a few minutes to respond to the questions and return the form to us. The comments that are received are reviewed by the ALCTS committee and used to plan additional continuing education offerings. And just a reminder that once again, this webinar has been recorded, and you will receive an email shortly after the conclusion of the webinar with a link to the recording. You will also receive a copy of the PowerPoint slides. And just to note that our next ALCTS event will be May 30th, and it will be on the topic of archival materials using RDA with DACS, D-A-C-S. And thank you again for joining us for this webinar. Information about all ALCTS webinars are featured on the ALCTS homepage, and the web address, I can't get my slide up, but it's on that slide. New webinars and CE events are continuously being developed, so check the ALCTS homepage frequently for new information. We welcome suggestions for webinars and other continuing educational opportunities. You may submit a proposal online using the ALCTS webinar proposal form found at the ALCTS Continuing Education homepage. In closing, I would especially like to thank Ava Sorrell for providing technical support for today's webinar. Ava and her colleagues on the CE Committee's technical support make it possible to present these webinars smoothly. Again, we sincerely appreciate your attendance today and hope you will join us again for other presentations ALCTS has planned.